functional classification of nerve system. No.
Central peripheral.
No.
Motor and
Somatic and autonomic. Yes? The somatic nerve system, somatic fibers, innervates what? Skin, skeletal muscles, soft tissues, except skin by the somatic nerve system is innervated. Fascias, for example, muscular fascias or other fascias of the body. Next, organs of special sensations, which are organ of vision, organ of hearing, organ of smell, organ of taste. Function of autonomic nerve system is innervation of smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and glands. What it means, understood why I tell this, because remember, today I will explain you spinal cord, yes, and spinal nerves. Spinal cord, spinal nerves are part of the somatic, consists of the spinal nerve somatosensory fibers. Okay, functionally, nerve system divides into two parts, somatic and autonomic, yes? Next, nerve system, by other classification, divides into the central nerve system and peripheral nerve system. Central nerve system means spinal cord and brain. Peripheral nerve system consists of 31 pairs of spinal nerves and 12 pairs of cranial nerves. About the spinal cord, where is located spinal cord? You don't
Here.
Here, what means here? Where is it?
In the vertebra.
Vertebra.
In the vertebral column.
In the vertebral column, what we have? In the vertebral column, 4 spinal cord. Vertebral canal. Yes? From where starts vertebral canal? From atlas, foramen of first cervical vertebra. That means upward the spinal cord continues directly into the first part of the brain, which called medulla oblongata. And because the level by the skeletotopically, the level where starts spinal cord, this is atlanto-occipital joint, where the atlas connects with condyles of the occipital bone. The other type of level from where starts spinal cord is that part of the spinal cord from where projects first spinal nerves. Lower end of the spinal cord, vertebral column, continues down into the sacral canal and finishes by the sacral hiatus. Yes? But spinal cord, which is located inside the vertebral canal, finishes at the level of second lumbar vertebra, or canal continues down through third, fourth, fifth lumbar vertebrae and sacral canal also. Understood? How the spinal cord finishes at the level of second lumbar vertebra. Now I'm explaining you external structure of the spinal cord, visible part, the shape, the parts of the spinal cord. Look, this band, this is the spinal cord. Here is upper organ, or this part is brain, from here starts. This is level of second lumbar vertebra, finishes spinal cord like tip, and this point of the spinal cord called conus medullaris, which is located at the level of second lumbar vertebra. But from conus medullaris down through that lumbar vertebrae and sacral canal, the continuation of the spinal cord called filum terminalis. But spinal cord forms what is structural unit of the nerve system? Neuron. Nerve cell. Yes? Or spinal cord, if you take internal structure, is formed by neurons. Filum terminalis, which is continuation of the spinal cord down, don't consist of neurons. filum terminalis is formed by the meninges of the spinal cord. You know the spinal cord and brain both have meninges, dura mater, pia mater, arachnoid and after pia mater. Yes? This coats continues like bend down and forms the filum terminalis. Next, look, the diameter of spinal cord is not same everywhere. Yes? This is upper part of the spinal cord, this part called cervical part, the neck portion of the spinal cord is dilated, and the second dilation spinal cord has in lumbar portion, and these two dilations have special names, intumescentia, cervical enlargement and lumbar enlargement. Next, external structure again. How many surfaces has the shape of spinal cord is, what's the shape? Cylindrical, yes? Because how you remember the vertebral foramens? If it's located there, little flattened from front and back sides, or has two surfaces, anterior and posterior. Anterior surface faces toward the vertebral bodies, posterior surface faces toward the vertebral arches. This is the portion of the spinal cord and visible anterior surface, and here is the posterior surface of the spinal cord. In the middle of the anterior surface, along of spinal cord, presents anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. This is groove, depression on the middle of the anterior side, but this depression is deep and because called fissure. If you take posterior surface, in the middle of the posterior surface, spinal cord has posterior median groove. That is groove because that is not so deep. By the anterior median fissure and posterior median groove, totally the spinal cord divides into two halves, right and left. Yes? Next, along of sides of the anterior median fissure, on the anterior surface, spinal cord has paired anterior lateral sulcuses. Same it has on the posterior surface. Laterally from the posterior median sulcus, spinal cord has posterior lateral sulcuses. By these sulcuses, each half of the spinal cord divides into three columns, anterior or parts, anterior, lateral, posterior. Anterior column is portion of the spinal cord between anterior median and anterior lateral grooves. Lateral column between anterior lateral, posterior lateral grooves, and posterior column between posterior median and posterior lateral grooves. But if you take upper cervical portion of the spinal cord, that cervical part of the spinal cord on the posterior surface, between posterior median and posterior lateral sulcuses, spinal cord has posterior intermedial sulcus, which separates this column, posterior column of the spinal cord, into two parts, medial, lateral. They have special names, fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus. How are formed these fascicles later? This is external structure of the spinal cord. Visible part with the sulcuses, enlargements, which are visible on the surface of the spinal cord. But if you take horizontal section of the spinal cord, I think you know two different colors or two different types of tissue structurally visible. Yes? How they called? What? White matter, which mostly located near to the surface of the spinal cord and deeply located gray matter of the spinal cord. Yes? And on the section also visible in the middle of the spinal cord, hole. This is hole or this is section of what?
Cerebrospinal fluid.
Central canal of the spinal cord, because in the middle of spinal cord there is space, tube, like tube, space, which has name central canal, consists of cerebrospinal fluid, and this canal from spinal cord upward, spinal cord continues into the brain, and this cavity continues into the cavities of brain, where they called ventricles, because if within the spinal cord it has shape like canal. In different parts of the brain, these spaces have different shape. They are large, more large than canal, and changes in names and called ventricles. That ventricles also contains what? Cerebrospinal fluid. Next, this external structure of the section or visible part of the white and gray matter, not structural part, visible. White matter, which located in anterior column of the spinal cord, or white matter between anterior median fissure and anterior lateral groove, has name anterior fascicle or funicle. White matter between anterior lateral and posterior lateral sulcuses called lateral funicle. White matter between posterior median and posterior lateral sulcuses, posterior funicle. Gray matter also divides, and I'm said only parts of one half. Same parts as other half also, yes? But the white matter, which is located in the middle or connects between right and left halves, also has special name and called white commissure, or this portion is white commissure, this portion is white commissure. Gray matter of the spinal cord also have shape like what?
Butterfly.
Butterfly or letter H, yes? And different parts are distinguished. Posterior horn, anterior horn, and mostly in the thoracic part of the spinal cord, the gray matter of thoracic part, generally, lumbar also has lateral horn. Lateral horn don't present in cervical part and lower sacral, later about this. Lateral horn, yes? And gray matter also has transverse direction, visible here on the picture. This portion of gray matter connects right half with left half, and this part of the gray matter called gray commissure. This is also visible part of white and gray matter. But how is formed white matter and how is formed gray matter? Structural unit of nerve system is neuron, but functional unit of the nerve system is reflex arch. Now, functionally, how many types of neurons you know? Functional classification. Sensory, motor, and interneurons, associated or interneurons, yes? 3 types. Each of them have, or neuron generally has how many parts structurally? 3 parts. Cell body, axon, and dendrites, yes? From these 3 parts, which part of neuron is myelinated? Axon. What color has myelin? White. That means white matter of the spinal cord generally is formed by myelinated part of neurons. Gray matter is formed by dendrites and cell bodies generally. Yes? That means Now, which type functionally, which type of neuron forms white matter of posterior funicule, lateral, anterior, and which types of neurons forms different parts of gray matter? How is formed the reflex arch? By three different neurons: sensory, interneurons, and motor neuron. Third is motor, last is motor neuron. Yes? Now from where starts sensory neuron? Axon of sensory neuron is unipolar neuron. What means unipolar? Has cell body from where projects one process, and that one process divides into two branches. From that two, one is axon, other is dendrite, can be. Yes? Sensory neuron, for example, if I touch what? Hot subject by this finger, what is the reaction? Contraction of muscles of this finger. Next, maybe contracts muscles of forearm, and I take totally my hand. Why? Because contracts muscles of forearm, arm, in some cases maybe I move with my trunk also. Yes? And my brain analyzes what? This is hot. This is which subject I touch, which finger pain. Understood or not? How? This is difficult reflex arch. But how I can understand these sensations, how my the nerve sensory fibers transmits these impulses. The sensory fiber, which starts from skin of this finger, starts by receptors. You know, they have receptors, yes, which takes the stimuli, transforms into the impulse, and that impulse transmits sensory fiber through this finger, hand, forearm, arm, goes back, and this sensory fiber enters vertebral canal through intervertebral foramen, enters the canal where is located cell body of this sensory neuron. Understood? Within the vertebral canal, but not inside the spinal cord, between the canal and spinal cord, located this structure, which is called spinal ganglion. How is formed spinal ganglion? By the cell bodies of these sensory neurons. Yes? This next, second branch of this sensory neuron carry impulse to the spinal cord. How this fiber enters spinal cord? Through posterior lateral groove and forms the posterior white matter of the spinal cord and passes to the posterior horn of the gray matter, where it finishes. Finishes means conducts impulse to second neuron, which is interneuron. Yes? That associated or interneurons generally are multipolar neurons. That means they have many dendrites. I'm showing you only this section or this section, this level of section, from where enters these sensory fibers and comes at this level of the gray matter. But that interneurons have many dendrites, which transmits these impulses toward the upper part of the spinal cord, lower part, different lower portions of the spinal cord, or some of them transmits impulse upward toward the brain, through the different parts of the brain toward the cortex. By the cortex, we can cortex analysis this pain, temperature, understood? Or that subject, or what I must do, take off the ubrać ruku, hand, understood or not? But except this, the easy reflex arch consists of only three neurons or associated neuron, which is located in posterior horn, transmits upward downward and at the same time transmits impulse passes toward the anterior horn of gray matter, where are located cell bodies of third neurons or motor neurons. That the axons of that motor neurons, here are cell bodies located and dendrites, yes? But axons of motor neurons, how they leave the spinal cord? Through anterior white matter or anterior funicle of white matter is formed by axons of motor neurons which leave the spinal cord through anterior lateral sulcus of the spinal cord and within the vertebral column, and after they leave the vertebral canal through intervertebral foramen, and that motor neuron passes back in opposite direction through arm, through forearm to this finger and performs contraction of these muscles. But why contracts these muscles also? Because that interneurons, no, listen, I'm explaining the way of impulse and answer on the impulse. But from the intervertebral foramen to this finger passes spinal nerve. That nerve is formed by sensory fibers and by that motor fibers. Understood? That nerve, or within the vertebral canal, these sensory fibers which enter the vertebral column and motor fiber which leave the vertebral column and passes to this finger within the canal, they unite, connects with together. Connects means both types are surrounded by one connective tissue covering and forms spinal nerve. Understood?
Yeah.
Что я хотела сказать? But if you take this level of the spinal cord, through the posterior lateral sulcus enters not one sensory fibers, enters many sensory fibers. Some of them start from here, others start from here, next starts from this region. Understood? That sensory fibers together which enter posterior lateral sulcus forms posterior root of the spinal cord. Through the anterior lateral sulcus leaves also many motor fibers. Together they form and called anterior root of the spinal cord. If you take one level, how is formed spinal nerve? By the connection of fibers of posterior root and anterior root. Yes? The posterior and anterior roots have different names. Posterior root or functionally sensory root. Also, by the way, ascending root or afferent root. Yes? The anterior root, other name is motor root, descending root, efferent root. Now listen, the spinal cord, by the length of the in length, spinal cord divides into portions. This is one part, this is another part, or portions, which called segments. Or, look here, from this section to this is one segment of the spinal cord. Or, how you can tell which part of the spinal cord called segment of the spinal cord. Portion of the spinal cord which gives paired motor and paired sensory roots or if by the connection of sensory and motor roots is formed one spinal nerve, means part of the spinal cord which gives one pair of spinal nerve called segment. If spinal cord totally gives 31 pairs of spinal nerves, that means spinal cord divides into how many segments? 31 segments. These segments divide so: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal. But don't mix with bones. We have not spinal cord finishes at the level of second lumbar vertebra, but spinal cord has lumbar, sacral and coccygeal segments also. How many cervical segments? 8 cervical segments. That means we have 8 pairs of cervical nerves. Thoracic, number of thoracic segments, 12. That means we have 12 pairs of thoracic nerves. Number of lumbar segments, 5. 5 paired lumbar nerves, 5 paired sacral nerves, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. And there. Here, it has. ეს პირველი კურსები იცით რა, რამდენჯერ გაუმეორე უკვე მაგას, სათითაოდ მოდიან და მეკითხებიან და საბოლოო დაზუსტებული მე რაც მაქვს იმ სწავლებდა მოვიდნენ ამას და არ მეუღებიან არაფერს. არა.
То, что ниже сакрум.
რომელი ჯგუფია? კი, მე ეს ჩემი არ არის მაიენდროზი ჯგუფია. არა, მაშინ ვერტვემე ყველა პედაგოგს და ჩამოვწევდი ერთად, ვის სადუზის იმდენ ყველა შეცვალა. კი ბატონო, ვერტვე დანარჩი. Argi, vedem da naše pedagogične zadake, da je sad mogačeno. I Argi. Što ja zabila? Or, now especially how is formed white matter of these different parts and how are formed gray matter. Or, I think you understood, the posterior funicle of white matter generally is formed by what type of fibers? Axons of functionally which type of neurons? Posterior. Sensory, yes, of course. How is formed anterior white matter? Motor. But spinal cord has lateral funicle also. Yes? How is formed lateral funicle? By mixed fibers. Sensory, motor, plus. Thoracic part of the spinal cord, the thoracic segments, upper lumbar and upper sacral segments. The lateral white matter of the spinal cord is formed by autonomic fibers also. If you take thoracic part, the lateral white matter consists of sensory, motor and sympathetic fibers. Why? When I'm explaining you the parts of the gray matter, I'm said posterior horn is formed by cell bodies of that interneurons, anterior horn cell bodies of motor neurons, and lateral horn has only thoracic part, that upper lumbar and upper sacrals. Why? Because lateral horn of gray matter is formed by autonomic neurons, or here are located generally thoracic portion cell bodies of sympathetic neurons. The fibers of that sympathetic neurons or that axons, they leave the spinal cord through, forms the lateral white matter and leave the spinal cord through anterior lateral sulcus together with motor fibers. Or that means if we have 8 cervical nerves, 8 paired, each cervical nerve consists of only 2 types of fibers, yes, sensory and motor. But if you take thoracic nerves, spinal nerves, thoracic nerves, except motor and sensory, consists of 3rd type of fibers, sympathetic fibers also. Why? Because cell bodies of sympathetic neurons located in lateral horns of thoracic segments and the axons of sympathetic neurons leave the spinal cord together with motor fibers and pass it through the spinal nerves. Understood? Next. You know what means nucleosis, yes? What are nucleosis? Other groups know, because they, I think, study in histology.
We didn't study.
Nuclei is the plural.
Nuclea, okay. How are formed that nuclea?
The cell bodies.
Cell bodies.
Pericardiums.
But why they have this is also formed by cell bodies. But each part of the gray matter consists of nuclei. That nucleus are formed by cell bodies of neurons with same function. Same function means which transmits same impulses. For example, anterior horn of gray matter consists of 2 nucleuses only, medial nucleus and lateral nucleuses. How are formed these medial and lateral nucleuses? Generally by cell bodies of motor neurons. But why we have 2 different nucleuses? Motor neurons means the fibers innervates what? Muscles, skeletal muscles, yes? Or the motor fibers which pass through the nerves innervate skeletal muscles of trunk and upper and lower limbs. Medial nucleus has all segments of the spinal cord, while the lateral nucleus presents only in that regions, 2 regions of the spinal cord, cervical enlargement and lumbar enlargement. Or because medial nucleus is nucleus which innervates the muscles of trunk, lateral nucleus is of cervical enlargement. That means from that lateral nucleus passes motor fibers for muscles of upper limbs. Lateral nucleuses of lumbar enlargement are formed by that motor neurons which innervates muscles of lower limbs. Understood? Or why the spinal cord has these 2 enlargements? Because in that cervical and lumbar portion, spinal cord consists of more neurons, more nerve cells than, for example, thoracic region. Why there are more neurons? Because additionally, except muscles of trunk, must be innervated muscles of upper limbs and lower limbs. Understood? Posterior horn of gray matter also consists of nucleuses. Generally, there are 2 main nucleuses. Thoracic nucleus and proper nucleus of the spinal cord. The thoracic nucleus is formed by cell bodies of sensory neurons which carry impulses from spinal cord to the cerebellum, the part of the brain. The proper nucleus of the spinal cord is formed by cell bodies of sensory neurons which transmits generally or which connects these two halves of spinal cord with together and at the same time carry impulses upward to the brain. And remember also one, the spinal cord divides into two halves. Generally, the parts of the brain also divides into two symmetrical parts. Each part has two symmetrical portions, right and left. But fibers, ascending fibers, which transmits impulses upward, or if you take descending fibers, which passes, for example, the cortex of the brain has gyruses, generally you know, I think, yes? We have two hemispheres, and for example, if you take precentral gyrus, is highest motor center, or motor fibers, descending fibers, starts from precentral gyrus. Maybe this is, I explain you this later together with brain.
Yes, please.
Okay, generally that's all about the spinal cord, and also study the meninges of the spinal cord also. Dura matter, arachnoid matter, pia matter. Between the meninges we have spaces, epidural, subdural, and subarachnoid. Subarachnoid space is between which layers? Which? And? No. Arachnoid and pia matter. This is important because subarachnoid space also contains what? Cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, great time.